All right, let's talk a little bit about functional groups. Now, your hydrocarbons are very unreactive, except for most notably combustion. You can get addition to some of those double and triple bonds. But a lot of times, the functionality or reactivity occur from functional groups. Just a straight alkane is not very reactive. The simplest functional group, we'll call those pi electrons to double and triple bonds, which we've kind of already talked about. More complicated functional groups contain other atoms, which we'll call heteroatoms, like maybe an oxygen or a nitrogen. They can be saturated, meaning there's no double bonds, like alcohols, ethers, amines, or unsaturated, meaning that there's a double or triple bond, carboxylic acids, esters, amides, etc. Or sometimes is used to refer to a generic alkyl group, some generic hydrocarbon group. It's not important to the discussion at hand. So let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. These are some of the common functional groups, where the functional group itself is there in the light blue, and you have the name of the compound. We'll talk a little bit about the nomenclature of these groups, but we're not going to really focus on that for this course. So as we mentioned, the carbon-carbon double bond is the alkene. It has an E ending, for example, ethylene. The carbon-carbon triple bond is your alkyne. That is your acetylene. And you see it there in blue. Then we have an OH group attached to a carbon-containing group, which this table pretty well universally uses the one carbon group, mostly the methyl group. So we'd have methanol. The two carbon containing groups connected by an oxygen with single bonds is an ether. In this case, it would be dimethyl ether, naming each of the groups that are attached to the oxygen. We mentioned the halogenated alkane, where that X could be a halogen atom, chlorine, fluorine, bromine, iodine. And in this case, you got chloromethane, where you've used a chlorine. You've got a nitrogen containing group. In this case, it's an NH2 group attached to an ethyl group, and so ethylamine. I went a little too far, didn't I? Now we get into some of the unsaturated groups, and we have that carbon double bond to an oxygen, which we call the carbonyl. And when that carbonyl carbon's attached to a hydrogen, at least on one side, we call that an aldehyde, ends in Al. And so that one is ethanal or acetaldehyde. Ketone refers to that carbonyl having a carbon containing group on both sides. In this case, that's propanone or acetone, which is actually quite common. The carbon double bond oxygen in the OH, so it's the carbonyl essentially plus an alcohol group. That's the COOH we talked about earlier in the semester. That's a carboxylic acid, and a lot of these organic acids have that COOH group. In this case, it's ethanoic acid or acetic acid. And then we have the ester, where instead of the H on the end of, like it was for the carboxylic acid, there's another carbon containing group. For example, we have methyl ethanoate or methyl acetate. And then you can have the carbonyl carbon, essentially with an amine group. We call that an amide. And so what we have is ethamide or acetamide. That amide group is important once we start talking about proteins and things like that. That amide bond is your peptide bond. So we want to talk about each of the functional groups in their turn, say a little bit about them. And then that's kind of where we'll leave it. So alcohols are derived from hydrocarbons. They have an OH group. They're usually ended with an OL ending, replacing the A and E suffix. For example, ethane becomes ethanol. Since the OH bond is polar, usually low molar mass alcohols are very water soluble. Methanol is used as a gasoline additive in a fuel. We have ethanol, which is drinking alcohol, so on and so forth. And so you see that's 2-propanol or isopropyl alcohol, which is our rubbing alcohol you can get from the drugstore. You can have 2-methyl-2-propanol, that's 2-butyl alcohol. You got 2 OH groups, and so instead of ethanol, we got an ethane diol, which is ethylene glycol or antifreeze. Phenol is our aromatic alcohol. If we got a propane triol, 1,2,3 propane triol, that's glycerin, which you can get at the grocery store. Biological alcohols would include cholesterol, and you can see rather large molecule. You don't need to know that for the test, but it does include an alcohol group. You don't have to draw that for the test at all. Methanol is produced with carbon monoxide and hydrogen under high pressures and temperatures. You could produce that. Ethanol, as we mentioned, is produced by fermenting carbohydrates. Polyhydroxy alcohols contain more than one OH group, like the ethylene glycol or the glycerin. Aromatic alcohols can be formed like phenol. But your aromatic alcohols do tend to be weak acids. And then, of course, we got biochemically important alcohols like cholesterol. Ethers, hydrocarbon groups connected by an oxygen. They're commonly used as organic solvents. Simple ethers are just named by naming the groups attached to the oxygen. Aldehydes and ketones contain the functional group that's a carbonyl carbon double bonded to oxygen. Aldehydes need to have at least one hydrogen atom attached to the carbonyl group. Ketones have 2 carbon atoms attached to the carbonyl group. And they're generally formed by the oxidation of alcohols. And so you can see there is the aldehyde with the hydrogen and the ketone. The R groups attached to the ketone do not have to be the same thing. Aldehydes are similarly named to alkanes, except the ending is AL. Carbon 1 is always the aldehyde group because it's on the end, because it's got to have an H for the simple aldehydes. Simplest aldehyde is formaldehyde, where both of the groups are hydrogen. Ketones are named similarly, except you're going to change the name to ONE. So essentially name the chain that includes the carbonyl carbon, and then change the ending to ONE. You'll have to number the location of the carbonyl. Simplest ketone has 3 carbon atoms and is called acetone. So you can see there's acetone and there's formaldehyde. Those are actually pretty commonly encountered. Formaldehyde is formerly used as embalming fluid, or at least a solution of it. Carboxylic acid have that COOH group that we've mentioned. Those are all weak acids. Typical carboxylic acids include, or in spinach, vinegar, various cleaners. Vitamin C is ascorbic acid. Aspirin is acetylsalicylic acid. Various citrus fruits contain citric acid. But they're used in a wide variety of applications, including polymers for fibers, paints, and films. Have that basic format with the R group attached to the COOH group. Here are some examples. There's formic acid, which comes from the ant bite. There's citric acid for citrus fruits, acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin, acetic acid, which is in vinegar. There's oxalic acid, which is just 2 COOH groups. Benzoic acid is our aromatic acid. Simple acids just get the oic at the end. A lot of the carboxylic acids reflect their origins. Instead of using the OIC and using the IUPAC name, we could use formic acid, which was extracted from ants, or citric acid, which is in citrus fruits, for example. They're usually prepared by oxidizing alcohols that they tend to be primary, oxidizing them further than say you would for an aldehyde. Acetic acid can also be prepared by reacting methanol with carbon monoxide in the presence of a rhodium catalyst. This is called our carbonylation. Esters, for example, benzocaine and sunburn lotions, ethyl acetate, nail polish remover, like your vegetable oils contain esters in terms of your, say, for example, triglycerides, polyester thread, aspirin. They contain that COOR group, where the R has to be a carbon containing group and not a hydrogen. The R prime can be whatever. Esters are usually prepared by reacting carboxylic acid and alcohol, eliminating the equivalent of a water between them. So the R group attached to the O directly is the R group from the alcohol, where the R group on the carboxylic acid stays attached to the carbonyl side. Esters are usually named given the alcohol part first and then the acid part. For example, you got ethyl from ethanol and acetate from acetic acid, so you would name that one ethyl acetate. Again, we're not going to focus on that for the test, but that's kind of how it works. In the presence of a base, you can saponify the ester, that is, break it apart into the alcohols and the acids. A lot of those are used in food flavorings and scents as well. Amines and amides. Amines are just organic bases where you can think of ammonia, except you replace one or more of the hydrogens with a carbon containing group. And you usually just, for simple ones, you just name the groups attached to the nitrogen. So you got ethylamine, you got trimethylamine, you got aniline, which is our aromatic one. Amides are the combination of the carbonyl and amines. Again, those are important for proteins. And simple amides are named like alkanes, except for changing the A and E ending to amide. So that would be ethanamide or acetamide.